Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Tom Smout, and I lead Aurora's GB research team. And today I am thrilled to be joined by Akshay Kaul, who is Director of Infrastructure at Ofgem. Akshay, thank you so much for making the time today. Just by way of a quick introduction, Akshay's background is diverse. He started out in investment banking, and after about a decade in the private sector, he's moved across to HM Treasury, where he spent about 5 years, including some time seconded to TfL, Transport for London. Using that experience in Treasury and in infrastructure, he then moved to Ofgem, and as part of Ofgem, which is part of GB's energy regulation, he's worked heavily on networks and moved into a more senior role as the Director of Infrastructure. Akshay, thank you so much for making time. By way of an intro, could you talk a little bit about your role and what that entails as part of Ofgem's brief?
Thanks so much, Tom, and thank you for having me on the podcast. As you said, my name is Akshay Kaul. I'm the Director General for Infrastructure at Ofgem, and I cover all the work that we do on infrastructure regulation, which essentially spans all of our network regulation, onshore and offshore, gas and electricity, transmission as well as distribution, including all the independent networks that we regulate, as well as the work that we are increasingly doing now to set up regulated regimes for low carbon investment in nuclear power, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen networks, and most recently, long duration energy storage as well. I also cover a lot of the systems regulation that we do. So we regulate the system operator, the National Energy System Operator, including all their work on balancing the system efficiently and connecting people quickly. And I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about that latter aspect. And then finally, a very important part, increasingly very important part of my remit is the cybersecurity of the energy industry. Ofgem is the competent authority alongside the Department for Energy for cybersecurity in energy, and we oversee the enforcement of all the regulations in respect of making the energy sector resilient to all sorts of cyber shocks. So that's the broad remit.
Thank you so much. It's a really broad remit, and it's a really interesting area. I want to start by talking about what I think is perhaps the most pressing constraint on GB's energy transition today, which is, of course, the state of our transmission grid. So just for some context for listeners who might not be so familiar, today GB has about 100 gigawatts of capacity connected to its transmission grid. That includes obviously lots of renewables as well as various generators and interconnectors. But the queue for new generation to connect to the transmission grid, which is obviously vital to enable the rollout of new technologies, is now extremely congested. So just to put some quick numbers to that, based on the latest that I've seen from the system operator, we have over 700 gigawatts of capacity at various stages in the connection queue. The connection queue is continuing to grow by a rate of, I think the average this year was 20 gigawatts per month. So every 5 months, essentially an amount of capacity equivalent to what is already connected applies for a grid connection. How did we end up in this situation to start with, and what challenges does it pose for the energy transition in GB?
Thanks, John. As you say, I think the delay in connecting projects to the grid is now one of the single most important blockers to continue decarbonization of the power system. And this increase in the waiting time has occurred really over the last 4 or 5 years. It used to be an average of 6 months that it would take to connect people relative to when they wanted to be connected. So an average of 6 month delay about 5 years ago has ballooned now to over 5 years of waiting, with some projects actually not. If you're joining the queue today, you won't really get a connection date this side of 2035. And that I think is a product of two problems. The first is a queuing problem, and the second one is a network capacity problem. The queuing problem is that the system operator has historically run a queue based on a first come, first served system, where the market just comes in whenever market participants are ready. They put in an application and they get quite easily and quite a low cost connection a place in the connections queue, and then over time they progress to getting a connection agreement if they meet certain conditions. And there has been not really any filter or quality check on that queue that's come out of the first come first served basis. And so we've had a situation where a lot of speculative projects which aren't making progress and aren't really going to convert to connection agreements are blocking the progress of projects that are ready to proceed. The attrition rate, in other words, is very high. 2/3 of the projects at one time that were getting a place in the queue were not actually proceeding to a connection agreement. And you can see this based on the stats you just read out. At the moment, the size of the connections queue is just north of 720 gigawatts. That is well in excess of what anybody in any scenario thinks we need for 2035 and even for 2050. So there is definitely an excess of projects in the queue, and the ones that aren't ready are blocking the ones that are ready. And so we engaged in a reform process to clean up that queue and prioritize the projects that are ready to go. But at the same time now, because we have this 2030 decarbonizing mission for the power sector, we're also trying to make sure that those projects that are in the queue are the right projects that you need to run a secure power system, decarbonized power system for 2030. So this movement from the first serve system to projects that are ready and needed for 2030 is the basic thrust of the connections queue reform that we're undertaking right now. And that, I think, will sort out the first part of the problem, which is the queuing problem. And then there is the connections, the network capacity problem. And that, I think, is largely derived from about 15 years ago, we introduced a policy together with the government called Connect and Manage, where we would connect a lot of renewable power plants first, and then the grid would catch up later on. And the problem with the grid catching up later on is that it's a very, very slow process. And what's ended up happening in practice is that the grid capacity has just kept lagging behind more and more and more and more. And so what we're doing on the grid capacity front is, for all the enabling works, we're trying to take a much more programmatic approach to getting network capacity in place sooner. And then for anything that is large-scale reinforcements, to allow bulk transfer of the power from one place in the country to another, we've actually moved from a just-in-time approach to an anticipatory approach in terms of trying to anticipate what is needed in the system for 2035 and then giving approvals on a programmatic basis for those projects to go ahead. And this is called the ASTI program, the Accelerating Strategic Transmission Investment Program, that I think has been quite successful in completely shifting the dial from a reactive grid capacity enhancements process to a much more proactive anticipatory system. So those are the two parts of the problem and how we're going to try and tackle them. But let me know if you want more on either of those fronts.
Let's start with the detail, and then we can go broad. So to begin with, when you talk about deciding which projects are going to progress and identifying the core projects that have to be brought through the queue in order to deliver on our targets and on good outcomes for consumers, what are the criteria that you're going to use to make those decisions? And what's Ofgem's role in defining those criteria and working with other stakeholders to make sure that the right projects are getting picked?
Yeah, so the proposals are actually being developed in consultation and collaboration with the industry by the system operator, National Energy System Operator, or the NESO. And we expect that by about February time, they will submit a well-developed proposal for queue reform into Ofgem as the regulator. And then we are the rule makers, so we have to either approve or reject that code modification, taking account of our duties to protect consumers. And that, if it goes ahead, then we'll be ready to go by April. And then between April and October next year, we will start to see the queue getting reformulated, and then the revised connection dates will be put out to everybody who's prioritized in the queue. At the moment, the system operator is essentially consulting on two types of criteria. The first is readiness criteria. So essentially, how do you tell whether a project is ready to proceed, will proceed to all the way to the connection agreement, versus projects that are more speculative? And this is in terms of essentially milestones. So they have to meet certain milestones of readiness and financial commitments in terms of putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak. And then we're also taking a look at some technology specific criteria, which is where the planning filters come in for 2030, which is, once you have a population of ready projects, are they the right mix of projects that the system needs in order to run securely a zero carbon system or low carbon system for 2030? And between these three things, then the milestones, the financial criteria, and the technology filters, we think that we will have the basis for essentially a prioritized queue that can meet the requirements of a 2030 clean power target.
Tough question, but is that moving fast enough? We have a target for 2030. Right now it's 24. You're saying October 25 we'll have a prioritized queue. That really gives you 4 years, 3 years if you don't count 2030, to deliver those projects. That is not a lot of time. And GB's history and its track record of delivering on these infrastructure projects is troubled.
It's a good question. I mean, I think what it speaks to is the need to do this at pace. So we need to get this done as quickly as possible. But you can imagine that it's also necessary to have a degree of rigor in the process, because you're essentially talking about prioritizing some projects over others. And there are lots of projects that will have, good, perfectly reasonable commercial interests in making sure that they are prioritized versus others. And so we want to give a fair opportunity to the industry to contribute to and be a part of the development of these proposals, so that they're done in a transparent and rigorous way. But I completely agree with you that they have to be done rapidly, and that's why we think this timeline for early next year is so important, because any material delays to that timeline then really do start to cause problems in terms of getting to 2030 in a sensible manner.
Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about the bigger picture. So obviously we have a new government in GB. As listeners may or may not know, we just had an election on July 4th. And the new government's agenda is very energy centric, and it seems to be quite interventionist. But that's part of a broad direction of travel. The previous government became more interventionist in its time, kind of overseeing the energy sector. So there does seem to be a general direction of travel in GB, away from a more market-led approach, as you were describing earlier in the connections process, to a more centrally planned energy system. Is that a fair characterization? And what do you think have been the drivers of that movement in the GB system?
Yeah, I think that is a fair characterization, Tom. And I think there is really no alternative to putting in a dose of central planning, because of the scale of coordination that is required to get all of the various types of infrastructures ready in the same time to run a secure decarbonized power system within a relatively short period of time. If you want to do that, there really is no alternative to taking a more centrally planned approach. And so for that reason, I think from an Ofgem perspective, we hugely welcome the energy as well as the passion and the commitment that the new government has brought in to doing that kind of central planning and coordination really well. I mean, as you said, even before that, we in Ofgem had been progressing with the previous government the establishment of an institution, which is the NISO, that could help to plan the system in a much more coherent way, both nationally and regionally. And what the new government has brought in, I think, is a very strong client capability within the department, with the appointment of Chris Stark and his mission control team to try and get all of the pieces together around a single spatial plan. And then we can make sure that all the various parts of the system, whether it's the NISO, Ofgem, the department in terms of their procurements of CFDs and capacity markets and so on, seabed leases, planning permissions, all of that can be properly coordinated. And indeed, the connections queue is a big part of that as well. All of that can be properly coordinated in alignment to a very particular target. And that, I think, is the most effective and probably the most cost-effective way of getting to a decarbonized power system.
How do you think the different groups of stakeholders feel about that shift for investors, is it scary to be moving from a world where outcomes are driven by the market to a centrally planned world? Or do you think it gives them confidence and reassurance?
Yeah, again, I think that's one shouldn't overstate the abruptness of such a move, right? It's not abrupt. This has been happening over the last 20 years, ever since the government brought in renewable obligations. They started to intervene in pricing in the market to try and shift the energy mix away from fossil to cleaner forms of energy. That intervention then deepened considerably with the electricity market reform 12 or 13 years ago, where the government then started intervening in both the low carbon side through contracts for difference auctions, as well as on the capacity side through capacity markets. And I think this latest round of changes is just the sort of logical culmination of that, which is that you can't just intervene in silos. The intervention, I think, has to be properly coordinated on a whole system basis across electricity and gas and new vectors like hydrogen to make a real difference in decarbonization and to do it properly. So I think it's part of a trend. And even if the government intervenes with much, much clearer central planning, my feeling is investors that I talk to, certainly on a regular basis, actually welcome that, because they see direction, they see clarity, they see a sense of purpose. And there is still a role for the market, really, if you think about setting prices, for various things. The auctions that we run for contracts for differences, for capacity, hopefully in the future for some types of network build, the market still has a role to play in trying to get the system built at the least cost, the most efficient cost. But having that clarity and coordination from the public sector, I think, is really, really important and will be welcomed by all investors.
How much do you think that shift from market to planned is specific to the context of Britain in the last 20 years? And how much do you think it's just universally a shift that's going to happen across the energy sector?
So I think we're seeing the same kind of problem in various countries. We talked to quite a few of our fellow regulators in America. We talk quite a lot to FERC. We talk to the Californians. We talk a lot to the European regulators, to Australian regulators, to the Indian regulators. And no matter where you are in the world, this task of trying to shift a power system from fossil fuels to some form of low carbon power, it requires a massive dose of central coordination. I can't imagine any system which is either wholly or even predominantly relying on market mechanisms in order to complete that shift. So governments are intervening, I think, in all of these jurisdictions. The question is more the form and the effectiveness of that intervention. And I certainly think GB has a lot of useful lessons, I think, for other countries that are interested in this, in that it is much better to intervene, I think, in a coherent and coordinated way across the system on a plan basis, than to intervene piecemeal, where investors can't really predict what form or scale the government's intervention is going to take over time. So I think it's part of a broader trend, and I think the experience of GB has lessons definitely for other countries in that respect.
Okay, so in a lot of ways, GB has been a leading country on the energy transition. We obviously have cut our emissions from the power sector very effectively, but not everything has gone swimmingly well for us. We have had some major delays. Prices in the GB market are now very high, both globally and even within a kind of local European context. What are some things, if you had to pick, say, 3 things that GB has done well, and 3 things that you think we could have done better that other countries might learn from in going through the same shifts?
So I think the biggest thing I think GB has done fantastically well is introducing a transparent auction-based way of giving support to renewables and then keeping the lights on at the same time. So I really do think the electricity market reform that we did about a decade ago is a world-leading example of fantastic value being created through an intelligent and well-designed set of interventions. Similarly, I think the work that we've done, if you pardon me for sort of blowing our own trumpet for a little bit, Tom, just in terms of the foundational change to network regulation from largely a reactive just-in-time system to a much more planned, anticipatory approach to network regulation. I think that's been really powerful, really, really important. And then I think the work that we've been doing together with the government and other stakeholders on making the system more intelligent, so that it isn't, you're not just building stuff in order to service demand, but you're able to use technology of various sorts to add flexibility to the system. I think all three of those areas, GB, I think, has done remarkably well in. So low carbon build, networks, and flex. I think we've done really, really well at. The biggest thing, the biggest lesson to me in terms of what we should have done better is if you look back over the crisis that we've just had, the gas price crisis that we just had, I think the single lesson I think that we take from it is that we are still far too dependent upon imported gas for a lot of our energy needs, and that makes our consumers particularly vulnerable to the shocks from international gas markets. And so I think there is a definite need to accelerate away from that dependence on imported gas to a much cleaner and more domestically resilient power and energy system. And I think, as you say, that's a mix of building on the fantastic progress that we've already made in the power sector, but in the next 10 years, I think grappling with some more tricky challenges as you get into the decarbonization of heat and then the decarbonization of transport, where I think quite a strong dose of consumer behavior change will be needed in those areas.
In any transition where you're going from a more market-driven to a more planned approach, there's inevitably a transfer of risk from the market to the consumer or the taxpayer, but eventually it's always the consumer who's holding the risk at some point. What are some measures that you're taking as an organization to manage that risk and to try and minimize the risk of the GB consumer being left with the legacy of some centrally planned decisions that maybe don't work out perfectly? I'm just thinking about this in the context of, for example, GB is supposed to have a new nuclear reactor at Hinkley Point. That's been delayed multiple times and now probably won't be on the system for that 2030 target, which is a big blow to decarbonization in that time frame. How do we manage that risk, and what kind of similar risks do you see, and how is Ofgem working to shield consumers from those uncertainties?
Yes, I think here there's a mix of things that are more to do with energy policy that I think are matters largely for ministers and the government to take up. But I think we've made a contribution in that area. And when I say energy policy, I mean the question you raised about the choice of technology, the choice of the generation mix. We think is a question properly for energy policy. But our contribution in that area has been to campaign for successfully setting up a system planning capability within the public sector, which is the creation of this state-owned, not-for-profit, independent system planner and operator, the NESO, which I think will definitely improve the capability within the government to make sensible choices. They'll never be perfect because you're always trying to plan against a very uncertain future. So there will always be some regret risks. There's always the risk of some stranded investment, like you said, Tom. But it will be informed by what I hope will be world-leading technical and engineering capability at the behest of in the service of the public sector as part of this NESO institution. And then I think the question then is also about the coordination, you see, between what the energy policy is trying to do with what the regulation is trying to do. And in the past, I think this coordination has not been perfect. And that has led to, I think, consumers paying very high costs, for instance, in terms of balancing the system, the costs of congestion, as the grid infrastructure has failed to keep up with the change in the technology mix and the deployment of renewables. And I think that is probably where we can make our greatest contribution, is in improving that coordination and then putting in place a regulatory system where network companies are required to invest in anticipation and required to meet very demanding time and budget targets of be on time, be on budget with all of these massive build projects that they're embarking upon. I think that's the way that we think we can help consumers move from their current situation, which is still highly exposed to volatile gas prices, to an energy bill which we hope will at least be more stable. In the next 10 years, it should become more and more stable, with renewables increasingly setting the marginal price for power and gas setting that price less and less and less.
That has become quite a hot topic in GB. There is, I think, a lot of discussion about the idea of the marginal price and how much renewables are contributing in terms of generation and how much they cost. And in this time of high gas prices, they're capturing a lot of revenue by selling into a market where the price is being set by gas. Is that a sustainable situation? Or is some kind of split pricing model inevitable?
Yeah. Are you an economist, Tom?
I've given myself away. I'm also a philosopher, which I think is perhaps the worst possible combo.
So I think that marginal pricing is not unique to the power system. It's the way that it's the way that economists think of the pricing of all commodities across the world. And there's nothing intrinsically problematic with it, other than, as you say, the main issue is that the marginal demand at the moment has to be met by gas-fired power plants. And so that sets the price a lot of the time. And that creates then these rents for everybody else, which people say renewable power is virtually zero marginal cost, so they're getting a big rent. Now, at one level, that part of the problem has been solved already through the shift to contracts for differences. Because if you are investing in low carbon plant, what the government is essentially saying to you is that you will get a fixed price contract through an auction. If the power price goes up because gas is setting the price above the strike price, then you have to return money to consumers. If the power price goes down because a cheaper renewable plant is setting the price, then you'll get topped up to your strike price. So in some ways, the government, if you step back and think about what it's done with contracts for differences, it's essentially committing consumers to fixed price contracts with renewable generators that insulate or shield them from the price volatility caused by gas. And then over time, as the generation mix changes from more and more and more of the demand during any given day being covered by renewable power, wind power, solar power, I think we're going to see gas setting the marginal price less and less and less and less often. So this, over time, if you let it play out, the problem in a sense will resolve itself. But obviously during the gas price shock, there was a big increase in rents to a lot of the renewable generators that weren't on contracts for differences. And that's why I think the government intervened in that particular episode. But hopefully going forward, the natural evolution of these contracts for differences should deal with that problem.
So one of the things that strikes me about this conversation is that you are a civil servant and a dedicated one at 10 years now in the civil service. And you're thinking long-term structurally about the system, about benefits and trade-offs. But a significant part of the decision-making is actually being made by politicians. And in GB, there's an election every 5 years. We have a target for 5 years from now, essentially. It feels like that policy landscape is quite fluid. How do we, as a country going through this transition, how do we balance that constantly shifting political landscape against the need for a good, stable, long-term, actionable plan? And what are some things that you would like to see coming out of energy policy to make that process easier or more successful?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And before I get into the long-term part of your question, Tom, I think we should acknowledge that the crisis isn't really over for a lot of households up and down the country. The coming winter is going to be incredibly hard. We've seen some estimates from charities saying half of all households are going to ration their energy use during this winter period. And so I think energy affordability is a fundamental concern, and the crisis isn't over for many, many households. And I think we just got to bear that in mind in terms of thinking about not just the long term, but the next 3 to 5 years. The consumers wallets and their balance sheets, I think, are both quite stretched. And I think it's a very important factor to bear in mind as we think about what we do. As I say, in the long-term aspect of this picture, to repeat something I said before, we think that the consumer interest is best served by shifting from a fossil fuel dependence to a clean energy system, which will have much more stable energy bills in it, because the price is going to be much more stable through these fixed price contracts. And that's the system we're moving to. But this transition between now and then, I think, has to be carefully worked through. And we are certainly encouraging government to think as creatively, as imaginatively as it can about how best to take consumers on that journey with us, to make sure that the system is not just decarbonized and secure, but it's also affordable for everybody that needs to access energy. Now, in terms of your question, a very good question about the way in which sort of long-term planning of the power system interacts with the electoral process, the political process. I think this is not a unique thing to energy. I think this affects all of the infrastructure sectors, actually. And in general, I've always been in favor of having a degree of institutional innovation to create technical or technocratic long-term plans wherever we can do that. And I think to that end, the Treasury was very supportive in setting up the National Infrastructure Commission, and now the new government wants to bring it together, the planning and the delivery, into a new agency called NISTA across the sectors. And in the energy sector, we have been pushing and have successfully now introduced, with the help of the government, an independent system planner and independent system operator. So you've got the basic technical apparatus to create a long-term plan. I think one cannot completely divorce that then from the political process, because in order for these decisions to have legitimacy, for the public to accept them and for consumers to accept them, I think it is essential that they should be backed by elected ministers, and they should be discussed and endorsed to some extent by representatives in Parliament. So I think that one can't divorce it from the political process, but having a base of a long-term technical plan, I think, guides and helps and informs the political process to be a lot more stable, hopefully, and a lot more predictable from an investability perspective.
Thank you very much. I mean, I'm going to finish up with a traditional game that we like to play on this podcast, which is called Overrated or Underrated, where I ask you to comment on things that you think are overrated or underrated. I'm going to pick one contentious topic, which is on a lot of people's minds right now, which is locational wholesale pricing. Overrated or underrated, in your opinion?
So a bit of both, really. I think the debate has got very unhelpfully polarized, and the proponents of locational pricing, I think, are exaggerating the benefits, and the detractors are wildly exaggerating the downsides. From an Ofgem perspective, we think that introducing locational pricing will produce modest but meaningful improvements to the ability to manage congestion in the power system, and that there are ways of dealing with a lot of the transition problems in terms of grandfathering existing assets and protecting future renewables investment. There's a particular issue with future renewables investment, which is ensuring that any price or volume risks that are created by zonal pricing are appropriately mitigated. But we don't at the moment see any reason why that cannot be done. So we think that it is an unhelpfully polarized debate, and in respect of what the government decides to do, we think there are perfectly plausible ways of enacting such reforms that should keep us on track for the targets that we need to reach.
Akshay, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. We will look forward, I think, with eager anticipation to seeing what comes in terms of grid connection reform and following the clean power target. All that remains for me is to say a big thank you from all of us at Aurora for making the time, and I'm sure all of our listeners are really grateful too.
It was really great to speak to you, Tom. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast.
That was Tom Smout, who leads Aurora's GB research team, talking to Akshay Kaul, Director of Infrastructure at Ofgem. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.